So why would we want to avoid sexism in language? The simple reason is that some people feel insulted by sexist language, and I think that's a good enough reason. Sexist language creates an image of a society where women have a lower social and economic status than men, and even in the world's most equal society, or one of the world's most equal societies, this is still the case, even in Swedish being used. And by using non-sexist language, we can actually change the way that we as users of English think about gender roles. It's a way of coming towards change. Becoming aware of your language use, by becoming aware of it, you can make a conscious decision to change things. For example, sexist bias can occur when pronouns are used carelessly, or when the masculine pronoun he is reused to refer to both sexes as the default one. So, by being aware of these things, we can create conscious change. Oftentimes the use of man as a generic noun or as an ending for an occupational title, policeman, it can be ambiguous and may imply incorrectly that all persons in the group are male. And finally, be clear about whether you mean one gender or both genders. So in writing, for example, B and C papers here at the university, we as the people who work here, we insist that you are gender neutral, or that you write both she, he in the sentence that you're writing it about. We do not accept the default norm of he. So my challenge to you then is to notice and to react. To notice when you see a sentence like this: a fashion model is usually obsessive about her weight, because there are fashion models who are male as well. And, for example, research scientists often neglect their wives and children. I know quite a few researchers, and they sometimes neglect their husbands and children as well. So, when you see things like this, then yes, I hope that you might register your surprise to them. And here's an example. A couple are mystified by how their white cat turned pink. They're out for a walk with their cat, and suddenly the cat becomes pink. And notice this part here where it says, his owners, Philip Worth, 66, a retired county council officer, and his wife Joan took their cat to their vet. So it seems that Philip Worth, the man, is worth mentioning, his age and also his profession. But as regards his wife, it was only Joan, the name, that is mentioned, plus that she is possessed, or she's owned by Philip Worth. She doesn't have an occupation, nor an age apparently. We now move on to the area of language and ethnicity, because I would like to draw parallels between language and gender and language and ethnicity. Language and ethnicity is the study of language use as it varies between and among users of the socially dominant culture, the language of the users of the socially dominant culture, and groups which share ethnic affiliations, and these groups which are socially marginalized. You can see pockets of this in Sweden. What we talk about Rinkeby svenska is a reflection of. It seems that all coexisting majorities and minorities seem to have one thing in common, and that is that the socio-cultural dominance of the former group, the one with the more power, establishes their ideologies or their assumptions or beliefs and value system. This becomes the norm, and these norms are then being shared by everyone, and it's a part of the common sense. So if this is the common norm, and then in a newspaper text it's regarded as being the norm, then it expects everybody to think this is okay, and you need to be able to register and to think about language usage. Here's an example of language and ethnicity use. I've seen articles in Britain where it might say there was a mugging which took place, and an old lady her handbag was snatched and she was beaten. And then it will say, the last sentence, police are looking for 2 black men. And for me this is a form of incitement, nothing else, an incitement to react racially. Because it would be different if the newspaper gave a description of these black men. For example, police looking for 2 black men who were wearing and who were walking along the street, etc. But by just saying 2 black men, for me, I think, well, why say that? What is the purpose? And I think the purpose is to incite a form of racially motivated reaction. Usually have a laugh about this with my students, when we're in real time and real space, how many terms can you think of, negative names, for labeling people? So the names of the ethnic majority. If I was to have a name calling competition with you, then I might call a Swede a Svenne or a Blekfis. And today I heard somebody say a cracker or something like that. I'm not sure, that was new for me. But I would stop at 2 or 3. There's nothing more I can say. I could maybe say whitey or honky, but they sound a bit corny, to tell you the truth. But what negative names might you call a person who is from an Asian background? Or you might call them a wog, paki, a nigger, a coconut, ape, monkey, coon, darky. There are many more negative words for myself as the invandrare in a society than it is for those who live in the majority as society. And this seems to be a universal trend. Those groups which have more power have more negative words than those groups who have less power. If you remember in language and gender, the groups which had more power, men, have many, many more negative words for women than women have for men. So that's as a comparison. So there seems to be lots of parallels between gender, ethnicity and age groups. The parallel is that of power and the kind of usage. And as I just said, there are more negative terms which exist for the groups which have less perceived power. And this is the case also for age groups too. And older people are called pensioner, OAP, fossil, raisin, duffer, bag, hag. OAP, by the way, I think is quite interesting. OAP means old age pensioner. That's a bit like saying the same thing 3 times to one person, I think. Rubbing it in, so to speak. So I ask you once again, does language influence thought, or does thought influence language? By changing our language, will it influence the way we think? Or is it thought which influences language? Or is it a question of both? Does language reflect the underlying attitudes that we have towards the old, the young ethnic groups and women? Then I'd have to say I think it does. So, if by getting rid or avoiding these terms, can we change our attitudes towards them, towards how these are connotated? So talking to the young, the old and the foreign, what are the characteristic features? Well, it seems in what we call child-directed language, there seems to be certain features. We use terms of endearment, pet, love, gubbe, älskling. There seems to be more repetition and more direct speech. Sometimes we who have more power on children or on even very old people, we expand on or finish their utterances which they have began. And we maybe change pitch and speed. I sometimes notice when I look after a neighbour's dog, then I use a kind of insert språk. Hej trasslar, hur mår du idag? And that's the way I'd speak to a small child as well. Why? I don't know. Question of habit, I guess. And also there's a lot of exaggerated intonation when we speak with children. And when we talk to old people, what is there? It's called elder-directed language. And we often use terms which refer to their primary feature, farmor, farfar, grandma, grandpa, nan. And there seems to be more repetition, more direct speech acts, and we expand on or finish an utterance, and there's a changed pitch and speed and also, as I said, exaggerated intonation. So with this age group there is also an asymmetry taking place between how language is used between somebody who belongs to the middle of life age group, and that's expanding from 20 to 60 or whatever, and this seems to be a norm. All of these things seem to be present when we're talking to those who belong to other minority groupings, i.e. ethnic groups. Then you find there are similarities there too. We use terms which refer to their primary feature, invandrare, utlänning, mörkhyad. There seems to be more repetition, more direct speech acts, and so on. Language use is closely connected to cultural expectations and stereotypes of people in these groups, and matched guys experiments reveal that. So this is a form of experimental usage, and that means that people were asked to listen to certain kinds of varieties of English being spoken, and then they were to answer, what are your associations with it? And some people wrote that, well, an elderly voice I associate with vulnerableness, forgetfulness, or perhaps even incompetence. Immigrant voices, they're often associated with being, as a comparison, temperamental, violent, incomplete, untrustworthy. When studying the relationship between language and power, interestingly, studying language use between these different groups has revealed a clear and present relationship between power and language. More powerful speakers tend to speak more, so in variations of gender, age, ethnicity. The group which has more power tends to speak more than the group which has less power. The group which has more power dictates the nature of the conversation, interrupts more, has more negative terms for the non-powerful group, and has more stereotypical perceptions of the less powerful group. That's why there are more jokes about them, because they have more stereotypical perceptions. There are more jokes about women negatively than there are of men. There are more jokes about the foreigner than there are of the host population. So, this brings us to the end of this presentation, which primarily looked at language and gender, but here at the end tried to also draw parallels between different age groups and different ethnic groups. The overall conclusion that more powerful groups have more dominance over language construction and language usage.